The world on fire, 5 leaders and a global conflict. Dawn broke over Berlin on September 1st, 1939, with the drone of 1,000 aircraft. In London, a portly man in a black suit stood before a mirror, rehearsing words he had hoped never to speak. In Moscow, a mustached figure in a white uniform traced his finger across a map, calculating betrayals yet to come. Across the Atlantic, a president in a wheelchair pushed away reports of European chaos, knowing that isolation was a luxury his nation could not afford much longer. In a small London flat, a tall French general paced in growing rage as he heard news of his homeland's capitulation. And in Missouri, a humble haberdasher had no idea that within 6 years, he would hold the power to end civilization itself. 5 men. 5 leaders who would shape the greatest conflict in human history, each carrying their own demons, dreams, and destinies. None of them knew on that September morning how their lives would intertwine, how their decisions would cascade through time, how their strengths and failures would reshape the world. None of them could foresee the price of victory or how history would judge the choices they were about to make. This is not just another World War II book. This is the story of how Winston Churchill's soaring oratory and bottomless depths of courage gave hope to a continent in flames. How Franklin Roosevelt's tactical brilliance and unfathomable patience transformed America from an isolated nation into a global superpower. How Joseph Stalin's brutal determination turned catastrophic defeat into unimaginable triumph at the cost of millions of his own people. How Charles de Gaulle's unshakable self-belief kept the flame of French resistance alive when all seemed lost. And how Harry Truman, thrust onto the world stage with no preparation, would make the most momentous decision in human history. Their story is one of unlikely allies and uneasy friendships, of shared triumphs and secret betrayals. It is a tale of how 5 imperfect men, facing the greatest challenge humanity had ever known, found within themselves the strength to defeat darkness, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. In the end, they would save civilization. But first, they would have to survive their own demons, face their own fears, and learn to trust their most bitter enemies. This is their story. Winston Churchill, from aristocratic roots to democratic defender. Chapter 1: An Aristocrat's Evolution. The boy who would save Western civilization began his life as a disappointment. On a bitter November evening in 1874, beneath the ornate ceilings of Blenheim Palace, young Winston Churchill entered the world 2 months premature. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, barely noticed. The ambitious politician was too preoccupied with Parliament to concern himself with a weak, undersized heir who struggled to draw breath in his first hours. That initial parental indifference would shape Winston's life far more than the grandeur of his surroundings. While Blenheim's 187 rooms echoed with the footsteps of servants and the whispers of aristocratic intrigue, young Winston found himself largely alone, seeking comfort in an army of toy soldiers he would marshal across his nursery floor. Each tin warrior became a character in elaborate battles he narrated to himself, his childhood loneliness unknowingly preparing him for the day he would command real armies in humanity's greatest conflict. "I have nothing in common with the little Winston who appears to me in the pages of my memory," he would write decades later. Yet that solitary boy's hunger for attention would forge the man who would stand alone against Hitler. His desperate need to prove himself worthy of his father's notice, a goal he would never achieve in Lord Randolph's lifetime, drove him to seek glory with almost reckless abandon. At Harrow School, where other sons of privilege coasted on their family names, Winston struggled. His teachers deemed him unpromising, his peers found him odd, and his reports home were dismal save for one subject. In history class, young Churchill came alive. While Latin conjugations confounded him and mathematics remained a mystery, he could recite entire chapters of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire from memory. He didn't just learn history, he absorbed it, sensing somehow that he too would one day become part of its grand narrative. The cavalry offered escape. Against his father's wishes, Winston joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in 1895. Here, finally, was a chance to prove himself. Between polo matches and military duties, he began writing war correspondence for London newspapers. When conflicts erupted, in Cuba, in India, in Sudan, Winston charged toward them with an eagerness that alarmed his superiors. He wasn't just reporting on history, he was determined to be in its midst. The Boer War transformed him. Captured by enemy forces while reporting in South Africa, Churchill orchestrated an audacious escape that made headlines across the empire. He climbed through a bathroom window, scaled walls in darkness, and jumped aboard a moving freight train. The adventure captured the public's imagination and launched his political career. Yet something more profound had changed within him. In those desperate nights as a fugitive, Churchill had discovered a truth about himself. He thrived in crisis. This self-knowledge would prove crucial 4 decades later, when all of Europe trembled before Hitler's war machine. But in 1900, as the young war hero took his seat in Parliament for the first time, no one could have predicted that this ambitious young aristocrat would become democracy's last hope. Certainly not his colleagues, who found him insufferably arrogant. Not the Conservative Party leadership, who would soon find him an unreliable maverick. And not Churchill himself, who dreamed of glory but had not yet glimpsed its terrible price. The seeds of his finest hour were already present. The gift for soaring oratory honed in empty nursery rooms, the deep understanding of history that would help him recognize Hitler's true nature, the physical courage tested in colonial wars, and the profound loneliness that would allow him to stand firm when all others wavered. But first would come decades of mistakes, failures, and what appeared to be political suicide. A journey that would transform an aristocrat's son into democracy's greatest defender. "We are all worms," Churchill once remarked to a colleague, "but I do believe I am a glowworm." The light he would eventually cast would illuminate democracy's darkest hour. Yet in 1900, as he strode into Parliament for the first time, that light was still dim, waiting for the approaching storm that would make it shine. Defiance and destiny, Churchill's crucial hours. The door to 10 Downing Street slammed shut with such force that the cabinet secretaries in the next room jumped. It was May 10, 1940, and Winston Churchill had just returned from Buckingham Palace, now Prime Minister of a nation that was losing the war. As he later confessed to his bodyguard, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." That destiny looked increasingly like disaster. Within hours of Churchill taking office, Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg on Western Europe. The Netherlands fell in 4 days. Belgium crumbled in 18. The French army, considered the finest in Europe, collapsed like a house of cards. Britain's entire army, 338,000 men, found itself trapped on a beach called Dunkirk, with the Wehrmacht closing in for the kill. But if the new Prime Minister felt fear, he transformed it into fury. During one of his first war cabinet meetings, a senior civil servant passed him a note suggesting they discuss terms of surrender. Churchill glared at the paper, then at the man, before setting it ablaze with his cigar. "Nations that go down fighting," he growled, "rise again. Those that surrender tamely are finished." The war cabinet meetings of May 25th, 28, 1940 would prove the pivotal moments of the century. Lord Halifax, the aristocratic foreign secretary, argued persuasively for peace negotiations through Mussolini. It seemed the rational choice. Britain stood alone, outgunned, with its army trapped across the Channel. Even Churchill's closest allies wavered. But in a series of speeches that one minister called a masterclass in political warfare, Churchill turned the tide. He didn't just argue against negotiation, he made resistance sound like the only choice a sane man could make. What few knew was that every night, after these battles in the cabinet room, Churchill would climb to the roof of 10 Downing Street to watch London burn. German bombers had begun their attacks, and the city's skyline blazed orange. His secretaries worried these nocturnal vigils would break his spirit. Instead, they hardened his resolve. The miracle of Dunkirk, where civilian boats rescued the trapped British army under fire, became Churchill's first victory, though it was really an escape from catastrophe. He transformed near disaster into triumph through sheer force of words. Wars are not won by evacuations, he told Parliament, before promising that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets. What historians would later discover was that he turned to his bodyguard after that famous speech and whispered, "And we'll hit them over the head with beer bottles, which is about all we've got bloody left." Summer brought the Battle of Britain, where 3,000 young RAF pilots faced 2,600 Luftwaffe aircraft. Churchill spent hours in the underground command center, watching as squadron leaders moved wooden blocks across a giant map table, each block representing planes full of boys barely out of school. Never in the field of human conflict, he would say of them, was so much owed by so many to so few. What he didn't say publicly was that Britain had come within 2 weeks of running out of pilots. His private secretary noted that Churchill worked 18-hour days, napping only when his body forced him to, often while dictating memoranda from his bed. He consumed remarkable quantities of whiskey, but those closest to him noticed he never seemed drunk. The alcohol, like everything else, fueled his defiance. That defiance proved contagious. When Hitler's peace feelers arrived through various channels, the British public, rather than grasp at them, turned them into jokes. "If you want to know why we'll win," Churchill told the American ambassador, "spend an evening in the bomb shelters with the people." He did exactly that, making frequent visits to bombed areas. During one such visit, crowds surrounded his car shouting, "Good old Winnie!" A woman called out, "We thought you'd come! We were waiting for you!" Churchill broke down in tears. By December 1940, Britain had survived its darkest hour. The RAF had bloodied the Luftwaffe, Hitler had postponed his invasion plans, and Roosevelt's America was moving closer to entering the war. But these successes came at a terrible price. 5 million tons of British shipping lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Coventry's ancient cathedral was a roofless shell. London's East End resembled a mouthful of broken teeth. Yet Churchill had achieved something that transcended military calculations. He had shown that Hitler could be resisted, that the Nazi war machine was not invincible. As he told his cabinet, "If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free." Standing alone through that desperate summer of 1940, Churchill had kept hope alive when all seemed lost. Late one night, after a particularly heavy bombing raid, an aide found Churchill again on the roof of number 10. The sky was full of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. "They're magnificent," Churchill said, referring to the people of London, "and they're all in this together." After a pause, he added quietly, "I'm getting quite good at this war business. But I hope someone else gets the chance to be good at peace." That peace lay years away through darker valleys yet to come. But in those crucial months of 1940, when civilization itself hung by a thread, one man's defiance had made all the difference. Churchill had not just led Britain, he had changed what people believed was possible. From polio to power, the transformation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In August 1921, a tall, vigorous man dove into the icy waters off Campobello Island. He would never walk unaided again. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, aged 39, emerged from those waters with an invisible enemy coursing through his body, the polio virus that would transform both him and the course of history. 7 years before that fateful swim, Theodore Roosevelt had dismissed his fifth cousin as a well-meaning young man of less than average ability. The description seemed apt. Franklin had coasted through Harvard on his name, married his cousin Eleanor despite his mother's fierce opposition, and appeared destined to be nothing more than a charming aristocrat playing at politics. Polio changed everything. The world became a different place, Eleanor would later write, when Franklin stopped being able to climb stairs. For a man whose political career had been built on vigorous handshakes and boundless energy, paralysis seemed like a death sentence. For weeks he lay in darkness, his legs useless, his political future evaporating. His mother urged him to retire to Hyde Park as a country gentleman. His wife watched silently as their marriage crumbled under the weight of his depression. Then something remarkable happened. The man who emerged from that darkness was no longer the breezy dilettante of before. In fighting for every inch of movement, in learning to lift his iron-braced legs through sheer force of will, Roosevelt developed a strength his earlier life of privilege had never demanded. He turned his rehabilitation into a military campaign. At Warm Springs, Georgia, where he established a polio treatment center, Roosevelt would spend hours in the pool trying to teach his legs to walk again. He never succeeded, but he learned something more valuable: how to appear strong while being weak, how to project confidence while battling constant pain, how to lead without being able to stand. "We are all cripples in one way or another," he told a young polio patient at Warm Springs. "The only difference is that some of us have to use crutches, and others hide their crutches on the inside." It was a lesson he would draw upon when facing a crippled nation during the Great Depression and later a world at war. By 1932, as he took the oath of office during the depths of the Depression, Roosevelt had mastered the art of invisible struggle. Few Americans knew he couldn't walk. Even fewer understood how his disability had forged his character. With radio as his ally, he turned his wheelchair-bound immobility into an advantage. His fireside chats reached millions, his voice projecting a strength and intimacy that made every American feel personally addressed. But it was the approaching war that would truly reveal Roosevelt's transformation. While Churchill raged publicly against Hitler, FDR orchestrated a more subtle resistance. Unable to march into battle himself, he became a master of political maneuvering. He saw earlier than most that American isolation was impossible, that Hitler's ambitions would eventually reach across the Atlantic. In 1939, as Europe erupted in flames, Roosevelt began one of history's most delicate balancing acts. To the public, he maintained neutrality. Behind closed doors, he worked to prepare America for what he knew was coming. He pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, which he described as lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. When critics called it a step toward war, he responded with a question: "Would you rather wait until the fire reaches your house?" His body might have been broken, but his political instincts were razor sharp. He outmaneuvered the isolationists, expanded the Navy, and began the largest military buildup in peacetime American history, all while maintaining the fiction of neutrality. When he told Congress that America must become the great arsenal of democracy, he was announcing a revolution in American foreign policy, wrapped in language that made it sound as natural as sunrise. In the summer of 1941, Roosevelt met Churchill secretly at sea off Newfoundland. The British Prime Minister found himself face to face with a man who could barely stand, yet whose determination matched his own. Together, they drafted the Atlantic Charter, outlining their vision for a post-war world. Churchill, desperate for American entry into the war, was amazed by Roosevelt's political constraints. "I do not know what you would do in my place," FDR told him. "I am walking on eggs, and I can assure you that I am not giving a thought to anything beyond today." That careful walk ended on December 7, 1941. When news of Pearl Harbor reached Washington, Roosevelt displayed the same iron control he had learned mastering his paralyzed legs. While others panicked, he remained calm, dictating his war message to Congress with the same deliberation he had once used to teach his body new ways to move. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The words were simple, powerful, and carefully chosen. Just as he had learned to appear to walk by swiveling his hips and using his cane, Roosevelt had learned to move the nation forward through the careful application of words and will. The man who could not walk would lead his nation to war on 2 oceans, orchestrating the greatest military mobilization in history. The invalid whom many had written off would become the architect of Allied victory. And the politician once dismissed as a lightweight would emerge as one of history's most consequential leaders, all because a summer swim had forced him to learn strength through suffering, mastering the art of coalition leadership. Dawn had just broken over Washington on December 8, 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt's wheelchair glided into the Oval Office. His secretary noted that the president seemed almost relieved. After years of diplomatic tightrope walking, the path forward was suddenly crystal clear. "We are all in the same boat now," he told his staff, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. That boat was sinking. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines would fall within weeks. Britain was bankrupt, Russia was reeling, and American military strength existed largely on paper. The United States Army ranked 18th in the world, behind Portugal. The nation that would become the arsenal of democracy could barely arm itself. But if his body was confined to a wheelchair, Roosevelt's mind ranged across oceans. Within days of Pearl Harbor, he summoned Churchill to Washington for the first of their epic strategy sessions. The Prime Minister arrived to find his host conducting affairs from his bedroom, papers strewn across his bed, maps covering every surface. Together, they would forge what Roosevelt termed the Grand Alliance, though privately, he compared managing his allies to keeping a basket of snakes pointed in the same direction. Churchill wanted to strike through the Mediterranean. Stalin demanded a second front in France. American generals pushed for an immediate cross-channel invasion. Each ally saw the war through the lens of their own survival. Roosevelt saw the bigger picture. "We must be the great quartermaster," he told his cabinet. "It is our duty to supply our Russian friends with the tools to finish their job." The president's daily schedule became a masterclass in coalition management. Breakfast with Chinese diplomats discussing aid to Chiang Kai-shek. Lunch mediating between squabbling French factions. Afternoon strategy sessions with his generals, who were learning to think in global terms. Evening radio addresses to the American people explaining why their sons were dying on distant shores. In public, Roosevelt made it look effortless. In private, the strain showed. His doctor noted alarming rises in blood pressure. His hands sometimes shook so badly he couldn't hold his cigarette holder. Yet he drove himself and his nation at a relentless pace. When his generals said it would take 2 years to build 50,000 aircraft, he demanded 100,000 in 1 year. They called it impossible. America built 120,000. The numbers were staggering. America would produce 297,000 aircraft, 102,000 tanks, 88,000 warships, 2.4 million trucks. Roosevelt drove this miracle of production while simultaneously managing a 3-dimensional chess game of global politics. He balanced Churchill's imperial ambitions against Stalin's territorial demands, all while maintaining the fiction that colonialism would end after victory. "I know he's a ruthless bastard," he told a shocked advisor regarding Stalin, "but right now he's our ruthless bastard." This brutally pragmatic approach extended to domestic politics. When labor unions threatened strikes, he sent troops to run the factories. When Congress balked at expenditures, he bypassed them through executive orders. The constitutional lawyer had become a wartime autocrat, albeit one who used his power to preserve democracy. At the Tyrant Conference in 1943, Roosevelt achieved perhaps his greatest diplomatic triumph. Seated between Churchill and Stalin, he played the role of mediator-in-chief. Though he could barely stand, he moved nimbly between their competing visions. Stalin wanted the Allies to invade France. Churchill preferred to strike through the Balkans. Roosevelt, knowing America's industrial might would soon make such debates irrelevant, promised both men what they wanted, then delivered what the war effort actually needed. His methods weren't always pretty. He played Churchill and Stalin against each other, leaked selective information to the press, and routinely misled Congress about the extent of American commitments. "You can't run a war by committee," he told his son Elliot. "Someone has to make decisions that will get people killed and then sleep at night afterward." As D-Day approached in 1944, Roosevelt's health was failing visibly. His hands trembled constantly, his face had grown gaunt, and his once booming voice had weakened to a rasp. Yet he drove himself harder. Every casualty report seemed to age him years, though he never allowed his staff to edit them for his comfort. "These boys are dying under my orders," he said. "The least I can do is read their names." What few knew was that Roosevelt was racing against time. His doctors had warned him his heart was failing, that he likely wouldn't survive another term in office. Yet he ran again in 1944, knowing that changing leadership mid-war could prove catastrophic. He won handily, though campaign photographs had to be carefully staged to hide his deterioration. In February 1945, he made his last great journey, traveling to Yalta to meet Churchill and Stalin one final time. The man who arrived was a shadow of the vigorous politician who had taken office in 1933. But his mind remained sharp, his diplomatic touch sure. He secured Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan, arranged for the creation of the United Nations, and laid the groundwork for the post-war world. 2 months later, he was dead. The man who couldn't walk had led his nation through its greatest trial, transformed it into a superpower, and reconstructed the global order. His final message to the American people, found on his desk in Warm Springs, remained undelivered. "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." The coalition he had built would survive him, carrying on to final victory. But those who remained understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. As Churchill would later write, he was the greatest architect of coalition victory in human history. From revolutionary to ruler, the rise of Stalin. The man who had sacrificed 20 million of his own people to defeat Hitler began life as Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, son of a drunken cobbler in the Georgian town of Gori. Young Joseph's face was scarred by smallpox, his left arm partially paralyzed from a childhood accident. His mother called him So-So. History would know him as Stalin, the man of steel. On June 21, 1941, that steel was about to be tested. Stalin sat alone in his dacha outside Moscow, studying intelligence reports that Hitler was about to betray him. Warnings had poured in from every direction: British intelligence, American diplomats, his own spies. He had dismissed them all. Now, at midnight, his phone rang. German planes had violated Soviet airspace. Still, Stalin refused to believe. Hitler wouldn't dare, he told his generals. Dawn proved him catastrophically wrong. 3 million German troops surged across the Soviet border. The largest invasion force in human history struck with such speed that entire Soviet armies ceased to exist within hours. Stalin's response was perhaps the most revealing moment of his life. He disappeared. For 3 days, as the Wehrmacht advanced 200 miles into Soviet territory, the supreme leader vanished. When his inner circle finally drove to his dacha, they found him slumped in a chair, hollow-eyed. "Everything is lost," he whispered. "Lenin founded our state, and we've squandered it." It was the only moment of public weakness he would ever show. When he emerged from that crisis, a new Stalin appeared. Gone was the revolutionary who had once robbed banks for the Bolshevik cause. Gone, too, was the paranoid despot who had purged his officer corps 2 years earlier. In their place stood a wartime leader of ruthless pragmatism. His first order set the tone for what would follow. There will be no retreat. When generals protested that whole armies would be lost, Stalin replied, "Then they will die where they stand." He reinstituted the practice of political commissars, party loyalists who could execute any soldier showing cowardice. When told this would handicap military decisions, Stalin simply nodded. "Fear," he said, "is a better motivator than courage." Yet beneath this brutality lay a mind of extraordinary calculation. As German tanks rolled toward Moscow, Stalin orchestrated perhaps the greatest industrial migration in human history. Over 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped east of the Urals. Entire industries moved in weeks. Workers reassembled machine tools in the open air, beginning production before factory walls existed. Stalin's methods were as crude as they were effective. When factory managers said evacuation was impossible, they were shot. When workers collapsed from exhaustion, they were replaced. But it worked. By early 1942, Soviet tanks and planes were rolling off assembly lines beyond Hitler's reach. In Moscow, as German forces approached within sight of the Kremlin, Stalin made a decision that stunned his allies. He stayed. While his government evacuated to Kuibyshev, the supreme leader remained, working from an underground bunker. His presence became Moscow's anchor. The city that had once feared him now drew strength from his refusal to flee. On November 7, 1941, with German artillery within range of the capital, Stalin ordered the annual Revolution Day parade to proceed. As Soviet tanks and troops marched through Red Square, he delivered a speech that transformed the Nazi invasion into a patriotic war. If they want a war of extermination, he declared, they shall have one. The man who had once waged war against Russian patriotism now wrapped himself in it. His personal habits during the war became legendary. He slept on a couch in his office, working until dawn, summoning generals at all hours. His meetings stretched through the night, fueled by Georgian wine and his notorious sweet tooth. Churchill, who met him in Moscow during the war's darkest days, found him a man of singular composure who could discuss the death of millions with the same tone one might use to order dinner. Yet that composure masked a calculating mind. When his son Yakov was captured by the Germans, they offered to exchange him for a captured field marshal. Stalin's response was ice cold. "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Yakov died in captivity. The supreme leader never spoke of him again. As the tide of war turned, Stalin's grip on power became absolute. The man who had once been outmaneuvered by Hitler now revealed himself as a master of strategic patience. He let his generals learn their craft through brutal trial and error. He allowed Zhukov, his most talented commander, enough freedom to win victories, but never enough to become a threat. He husbanded his forces for massive counteroffensives while letting his allies bleed themselves in smaller battles. By 1943, the results were undeniable. Soviet industry was outproducing German factories. The Red Army had learned to fight modern war at terrible cost. And Stalin had mastered the art of coalition warfare, playing his allies against each other while extracting maximum aid from both. At Tehran, Roosevelt found him to be a prisoner of suspicion. Churchill called him a deadly creature of unfathomable cunning. Both men discovered that arguing with Stalin was like arguing with a mountain. He simply absorbed their words and remained unmoved. His diplomatic technique never varied: demand everything, concede nothing, and wait for the other side to exhaust itself. The Georgian cobbler's son had become master of life and death for millions. The revolutionary who had once robbed banks to support the cause now commanded the world's largest army. And the man who had nearly broken in the war's first days had transformed himself into a leader whose shadow would darken Europe for decades to come. History, Stalin once remarked, is written in blood. He would ensure that his chapter would be written in oceans of it. The cost of victory, Stalin's relentless pursuit. For a moment, there was total silence, wrote a Soviet soldier who witnessed the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. Then Stalin walked forward, picked up a piece of charred brick from what had been Hitler's bunker, and smiled. It was the only time during the entire war I saw him truly smile. That smile had cost 27 million Soviet lives. The road to Berlin was paved with sacrifices that would have broken lesser nations. But Stalin had learned one lesson in his rise from Georgian revolutionary to supreme leader. There is no victory without cost, and no cost too high for victory. His strategy reflected this brutal calculus. When told that Soviet casualties were 5 times higher than German losses, Stalin shrugged. "Quantity," he said, "has a quality all its own." He turned Russia's greatest weakness, its seemingly endless supply of manpower, into its ultimate strength. The Wehrmacht could win every battle, but they couldn't kill Russians faster than Stalin could replace them. The supreme leader orchestrated the war from a small office in the Kremlin, its walls lined with maps. He slept on a narrow couch, working through the night, moving armies like chess pieces across the vastness of Russia. His commanders came to fear the soft click of his pipe tobacco against the ashtray. It meant he was thinking, and Stalin's thoughts usually ended with thousands dead. In the summer of 1943, he unveiled his masterpiece of industrial warfare. Operation Bagration began with a deception worthy of the theater Stalin had loved in his youth. The Red Army appeared to be massing for an attack in Ukraine. The Germans reinforced the south. Then, with timing that would have impressed a conductor, Stalin unleashed 1.6 million men, 24,000 artillery pieces, and 4,000 tanks in Belorussia. German Army Group Center ceased to exist in weeks. It was, a captured German general admitted, like fighting a hydra. Cut off one Soviet army and 2 more appeared. What he couldn't see was the brutal efficiency behind this seemingly endless supply of forces. Stalin had transformed the entire Soviet Union into a war machine. Children worked 12-hour shifts in factories. Women plowed fields by hand. Prisoners were given the choice between combat or execution. The cost was staggering. In the siege of Leningrad alone, 1 million civilians died. Stalin's response was to tighten rationing for the survivors. The dead needed no food, and the living could survive on less. When Churchill expressed shock at Soviet casualties, Stalin responded with a question that silenced the room. "When you have seen as many dead Russians as I have, Mr. Churchill, then you may speak to me of casualties." His methods grew more ruthless as victory approached. The race for Berlin became a competition between his marshals, with the losers facing disgrace or worse. He deliberately kept his allies in the dark about his military plans, positioning Soviet forces for post-war dominance while pretending to coordinate strategy. In conquered territories, the NKVD followed close behind the Red Army, establishing control that would last for decades. Stalin wasn't just winning the war, he was building an empire. When advised that taking Berlin would cost an extra 100,000 Soviet lives, he didn't hesitate. "History," he told Zhukov, "will not ask how many died. It will only ask who reached Berlin first." The final assault on Berlin was vintage Stalin, massive, methodical, and indifferent to losses. Soviet artillery fired more shells in the battle for Berlin than the United States used in the entire war. Block by block, the Red Army ground down the Nazi capital, raising the red flag over the Reichstag on April 30th, 1945. Stalin didn't attend the German surrender ceremony. Instead, he remained in Moscow, studying reports of American atomic research. Even in victory, he was planning his next move. When news of the Japanese surrender reached him, he remarked only that peace would require different weapons. The war's end found him at the peak of his power. The Soviet Union stretched from Berlin to the Pacific. The Red Army was the largest military force on Earth, and Stalin had achieved something even his allies didn't fully grasp. He had transformed Russia from a backward agrarian nation into an industrial superpower. At the Potsdam Conference, President Truman found himself facing a different Stalin than Roosevelt had known. Gone was any pretense of alliance. In its place sat a man of granite certainty, planning decades ahead while his counterparts thought in years. "We cannot go on living like this forever," Churchill had once said of Stalin's demands. The Supreme Leader's response was characteristic. Why not? The man of steel had bent the arc of history through sheer force of will at a cost beyond calculation. He had driven his nation to victory through terror, transformed it through industrialization, and positioned it to dominate half of Europe. In a final irony, the war that should have destroyed Soviet power had instead entrenched it. Stalin's empire would outlive him by decades, held together by the methods he had perfected during the conflict: fear, force, and the infinite capacity for sacrifice. When asked years later about the war's cost, Stalin gave perhaps his most honest answer: "Death solves all problems." No man, no problem. It was the epitaph of an era written in the blood of millions, the flame of French resistance. On June 17, 1940, a tall, awkward brigadier general sat in a small London flat listening to news of France's surrender on the radio. As Marshal Pétain's quavering voice announced the armistice with Nazi Germany, Charles de Gaulle's hands clenched into fists. "France has lost a battle," he muttered, "but France has not lost the war." To most observers, this statement seemed delusional. France had collapsed in 6 weeks. Its armies were destroyed, its government had fled, and Hitler's troops were marching down the Champs-Élysées. De Gaulle's Free French movement consisted of exactly one person: himself. He had no troops, no territory, and no official position. What he did have was something far more powerful: an unshakable conviction in France's destiny and his role in it. The next day, he strode into the BBC studios in London. Standing 6 feet 5 inches tall, his bearing as rigid as his principles, de Gaulle delivered the speech that would change history. The flame of French resistance must not and will not be extinguished. His voice, recorded on aging equipment, crackled across the channel into occupied France. Few heard it that first night. Those who did found themselves electrified by its audacity. Churchill, watching de Gaulle in those early days, observed, "He thinks he's Joan of Arc, and he doesn't even look good in a dress." Yet the British Prime Minister recognized something essential about this strange, difficult man. In an era of compromise and surrender, de Gaulle refused to bend. His stubbornness, which had hindered his military career in peacetime, became his greatest asset in war. His early days in London set the pattern. When British officials treated him as a junior ally, he demanded the respect due to France itself. When they tried to control his broadcasts, he threatened to find another radio station. "I am France," he would say, without a trace of humility. The British found him insufferable, but they needed him. He was their only link to occupied France. De Gaulle turned his weaknesses into strengths with remarkable skill. His lack of official position became proof of his independence. His isolation demonstrated his purity of purpose. His very awkwardness in social situations reinforced his image as a man above ordinary politics. When asked how he could claim to represent France with no electoral mandate, he replied, "Joan of Arc had no mandate either." From his London exile, he began weaving together the threads of resistance. His radio broadcasts, delivered in precise, aristocratic French, gave voice to a nation's shame and hope. Honor, common sense, and the interests of the country command all free French citizens to fight wherever they may be, and however they can. The words were carefully chosen, not just to rally supporters, but to shame those who collaborated. His methods were as unconventional as his position. He recruited French colonies one by one, building an alternative France beyond Hitler's reach. When Vichy diplomats protested, he simply ignored them. When the British or Americans tried to deal with other French factions, he made himself so impossible to bypass that they were forced to work with him. In December 1941, the tiny Free French Navy seized the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon off Canada's coast. The Americans were furious. It violated their hemisphere's neutrality. De Gaulle's response was characteristic. France has interests everywhere where the French flag has flown. The incident nearly caused a diplomatic crisis. It also demonstrated that Free France was a force that could not be ignored. His relationship with his allies was perpetually stormy. Roosevelt called him an apprentice dictator and tried to exclude him from planning meetings. Churchill, though more sympathetic, found himself constantly mediating between de Gaulle and angry American generals. "The heaviest cross I have to bear," Churchill complained, "is the Cross of Lorraine," referring to de Gaulle's chosen symbol. Yet de Gaulle's intransigence served a crucial purpose. By refusing to compromise, by insisting on France's place at the table, he kept alive the idea of France as a great power. When others saw a defeated nation, he saw a temporary eclipse of eternal France. His arrogance was not personal, it was patriotic. In the darkest days, when it seemed the Allies might bypass him entirely, de Gaulle remained unmoved. "France cannot be France without greatness," he declared. Many mocked such pronouncements. But in the cafes of occupied Paris, in the mountains where the Maquis fought, in the colonies where the Free French flag still flew, his words resonated. He had given pride back to a humiliated nation. By 1944, the force of his personality had achieved the impossible. The man who had started with nothing but his conviction had become the undisputed leader of French resistance. The various resistance movements unified under his command. The colonial empire rallied to his cause. Even his American critics were forced to acknowledge that there was no alternative to de Gaulle. On the eve of D-Day, he drafted his proclamation to the French people. His staff suggested changes to make it more diplomatic. De Gaulle refused. "France," he said, "does not need to ask permission to be France." The next day, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, his voice once again crackled across the radio waves, calling his nation to arms. The apprentice dictator had become something else entirely, the living embodiment of French resistance. Through sheer force of will, he had kept France's honor alive when all seemed lost. Now, as liberation approached, he prepared for his greatest challenge, rebuilding a nation from the ashes of defeat. Honor, he would often say, was like a match. It can only be lit once. In the darkest days of occupation, de Gaulle had kept that match burning, guarding its flame with the fierce devotion of a prophet. Soon he would use it to relight the torch of French greatness. Return to glory. The rise of Charles de Gaulle. Paris erupted in gunfire on August 25, 1944. The Wehrmacht still held key positions throughout the city when Charles de Gaulle did the unthinkable. He walked, completely exposed, down the middle of the Champs-Élysées. Snipers' bullets cracked around him, but he never broke stride. The man who had left France as a lonely exile returned as something between a king and a prophet, his very presence daring death to touch him. "Why didn't you duck?" an aide asked him later that day. De Gaulle's response was pure theater. The head of France cannot bow. In that moment, before cheering crowds and hidden marksmen, he transformed military liberation into something deeper, the resurrection of French dignity. But Paris was a city of ghosts. 4 years of occupation had left deep scars. Food was scarce, collaboration had poisoned relationships, and the apparatus of Vichy government remained largely intact. De Gaulle's first act was to refuse to acknowledge that the Vichy regime had ever legally existed. With a stroke of rhetorical genius, he declared the Republic had never ceased to exist. It had merely been in exile with him. "France has been liberated from the outside by herself," he announced, a paradox that somehow made perfect sense to a nation desperate to rebuild its self-image. When an American general tried to install a military government in liberated territories, de Gaulle simply ignored him and appointed his own administrators. "France," he said, "is not a country that can take orders." His method of handling collaborators revealed the same blend of theatricality and ruthless practicality. High-profile trials satisfied the public's desire for justice, while a complex system of national indignity charges allowed lesser offenders to purge their guilt through public service. When accused of being too lenient with some former Vichy officials, he responded, "France needs administrators who know where the light switches are." In rebuilding France's military pride, de Gaulle performed a similar balancing act. He insisted that French troops lead the liberation of key cities, even when American commanders protested the delays this caused. Yet he also quietly integrated resistance fighters into regular army units, preventing the kind of military fragmentation that had plagued France after World War I. The provisional government he established walked a tightrope between revolution and restoration. Communists were given ministries but kept away from key power centers. Women were granted the vote. Banks and key industries were nationalized. Each reform was presented not as change but as the natural evolution of eternal France. When Churchill and Roosevelt continued to treat him as a junior partner, de Gaulle responded by developing an independent foreign policy. He signed a treaty with Stalin without consulting his Anglo-American allies. "France has no friends," he declared, "only interests." The statement shocked diplomats, but thrilled a nation rediscovering its pride. By 1945, he had achieved what seemed impossible in 1940. France sat at the victor's table, occupied a zone of Germany, and held a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Yet, at the moment of his greatest triumph, de Gaulle did something that stunned the world. He resigned. "I have restored France's sovereignty," he told his cabinet in January 1946. "Now let the Republic's politicians squabble over it." He retreated to his home at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, writing his war memoirs and watching as the Fourth Republic stumbled from crisis to crisis. 12 years later, as France teetered on the brink of civil war over Algeria, the nation turned to him again. His return to power in 1958 was less dramatic than his wartime leadership, but no less revolutionary. In creating the Fifth Republic, he finally built the strong presidential system he had envisioned during his London exile. The constitution he crafted reflected everything he had learned about power and legitimacy during the war years. It created a presidency with almost monarchical authority, balanced by direct election. "A king in all but name," critics charged. "A republican monarch," de Gaulle corrected. His ultimate legacy was not just the salvation of French honor in war, but the creation of a stable French democracy in peace. The Fifth Republic survived his departure and continues to shape French politics today. The man who had once stood alone in London had rebuilt his nation's institutions as thoroughly as its pride. When he finally retired for good in 1969, France had regained not just its independence but its sense of greatness. The nuclear force de frappe he created gave France military autonomy. His policy of grandeur restored French influence worldwide. Even his frequent defiance of American leadership served a purpose. It showed France could still act as a great power. "I have tried to give France what she needed," he wrote in retirement. "Now she must learn to live without me." It was perhaps his final paradox. The man often accused of authoritarian tendencies had created durable democratic institutions, while the nationalist had secured France's place in a united Europe. The tall, awkward general who had refused to accept defeat had done more than save French honor. He had reinvented what it meant to be French in the modern world. His greatest achievement was not just that France survived, but that it could once again stand tall among nations, its head unbowed, just as he had walked unbowed down the Champs-Élysées in 1944. From haberdasher to history, Harry Truman's unexpected presidency. On April 12, 1945, Harry Truman was having a drink in the US Capitol's private lounge when House Speaker Sam Rayburn grabbed his arm. "Harry, go to the White House right away. And don't stop to talk to anybody." The vice president's face went white. He knew what those words meant. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. Hours later, Truman stood in the White House cabinet room, raising his right hand to take the oath of office. His left hand rested on a Bible given to him by his mother. As Chief Justice Harlan Stone pronounced the final words, witnesses saw Truman's hand trembling. "Boys," he said to reporters afterward, "if you ever pray, pray for me now." The prayer was needed. Truman had been vice president for just 82 days. Roosevelt had never shared his war plans, never included him in strategy sessions, never even told him about the atomic bomb. Now, this former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, held the fate of the world in his shaking hands. "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. he wrote in his diary that night. The sentiment was shared by America's allies. Churchill's first reaction was barely concealed panic. Who is Truman? Stalin's spies rushed to compile dossiers on this unknown quantity. Both men assumed they could easily manipulate this seemingly simple Midwesterner. They would soon learn otherwise. Behind Truman's plain-spoken manner lay a mind of surprising complexity and a will of pure Missouri limestone. Within hours of taking office, he began a crash course in global strategy. His daily schedule became a graduate seminar in war leadership. Mornings with generals explaining military operations, afternoons with scientists discussing atomic physics, evenings with diplomats outlining the intricacies of European politics. His first major test came at Potsdam, facing Stalin and Churchill across the conference table. The Soviet leader tried to intimidate him with long silences. Churchill attempted to overwhelm him with historical analogies. Truman countered with direct questions that cut through diplomatic fog. When Stalin began one of his rambling monologues, Truman interrupted. "Are you done now? Because I've got some things to say." What none at the table knew was that Truman carried a secret that changed everything. On July 16th, while at Potsdam, he received a coded message. "Baby boy successfully delivered." The atomic bomb had been tested successfully in New Mexico. Suddenly, the new president held the most powerful card in diplomatic history. His decision to use that card would haunt history. Every morning, casualty reports from the Pacific landed on his desk. Plans for invading Japan predicted up to 1 million American casualties, even more Japanese deaths. The bomb offered a way to end the war quickly, but at what moral cost? Truman's process was characteristic. He gathered information, consulted advisors, then made a clear decision. "The buck stops here," he would later put on a sign on his desk. On August 6, 1945, that buck bought apocalypse for Hiroshima. The decision's aftermath revealed another side of Truman. When scientists proposed a demonstration bomb over Tokyo Bay instead of direct use, he heard them out respectfully. When generals requested more atomic bombs for tactical use, he refused firmly. Later, when called a butcher for his decision, he accepted the criticism without deflecting blame. The decision was his alone, and he would bear its weight. But the atomic bomb was only the beginning. As victory celebrations faded, Truman faced a world transforming at dizzying speed. The Soviet Union, no longer an ally, began swallowing Eastern Europe. Britain, exhausted by war, could no longer play global policeman. Into this vacuum stepped America, with a former haberdasher at its helm. Truman's response was to redraw the architecture of global power. The Marshall Plan would rebuild Europe. The Truman Doctrine would contain Soviet expansion. NATO would bind Western democracies together. Each initiative emerged from late-night sessions in the Oval Office, where Truman questioned, probed, and finally decided. "I never felt I had to be president," he told an aide. "I just had to do what a president should do." That simple philosophy would reshape the post-war world. The man who had stumbled into history's spotlight would never be remembered as a great orator like Churchill or a grand strategist like Roosevelt. Instead, he would be remembered as something perhaps more important, the right man at the right moment. The decisions he made in those first months would echo through decades. The atomic age, the Cold War, the American century, all emerged from choices made by a former haberdasher thrust into history's crucible. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office, reading reports of a world in transformation, knowing that the next chapter of human history would begin with his signature. "I'm not the biggest man in this job," he wrote to his sister, "but I've got to be big enough for whatever comes." The simplicity of that statement masked the profundity of the challenge ahead. The man who had sold hats in Kansas City was about to shape the post-war world, the architect of the post-war world. On March 12, 1947, Harry Truman stood before Congress with a speech that would divide the world in two. The British ambassador had just informed him that Britain could no longer protect Greece and Turkey from Soviet pressure. In that moment, Truman made a decision that would define the next half-century. America would step into Britain's shoes as defender of the free world. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation, he declared. With those words, the Truman Doctrine was born. The former artillery captain from World War I had just committed America to a new kind of war, one that would be fought with dollars and ideas as much as bullets. Behind closed doors, Truman's advisors warned him about the cost. Senator Arthur Vandenberg put it bluntly. "Mr. President, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people." Truman's response was characteristic. "Senator, I'm just going to give them the facts." Those facts were stark. Europe lay in ruins. France and Italy teetered on the edge of communist revolution. Britain, the old imperial power, was bankrupt. Into this vacuum, Stalin was pushing with methodical determination. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill had named it, was descending across Europe. Truman's response was the Marshall Plan, the most ambitious foreign aid program in history. When critics called it wasteful, he shot back, "It's cheaper than another war." When conservatives labeled it socialism, he rebranded it as an investment in American prosperity. When Stalin offered to let Eastern European nations participate, hoping to sabotage the plan, Truman called his bluff by agreeing, knowing Stalin would never allow his satellites such freedom. The president's ability to play hardball surprised his opponents. When Stalin blockaded West Berlin in 1948, many expected Truman to back down. Instead, he ordered the Berlin Airlift, an operation of breathtaking audacity. For 11 months, American and British planes landed every 3 minutes in Berlin, delivering everything from coal to candy. Stalin blinked first. The blockade was lifted. But Truman's most crucial decisions happened far from public view. In shadowy meetings at the Pentagon and State Department, he approved the creation of the CIA, established the National Security Council, and unified the armed forces under a single Department of Defense. The machinery of American global power was being built, piece by careful piece. NSC 68, a classified document that landed on his desk in 1950, called for a massive military buildup to counter Soviet expansion. The cost would be staggering. Truman studied the numbers late into the night, then approved the plan. "We're not doing this to fight a war," he told his budget director. "We're doing it to prevent one." The Korean War tested both his resolve and his strategy. When North Korea invaded the South in June 1950, Truman didn't hesitate. Within hours, American forces were committed. But his true masterstroke was diplomatic. He got the UN Security Council to authorize military action while the Soviet delegate was boycotting the session. The war revealed Truman's steel. When General MacArthur publicly challenged his authority, Truman fired him, despite MacArthur's hero status and warnings of political suicide. "There can be only one commander-in-chief," he said simply. His popularity plummeted, but the principle of civilian control over the military was preserved. By 1952, Truman's approval ratings had dropped to 22%. The Korean War dragged on. McCarthy's red baiting had poisoned domestic politics. Yet the structures Truman built would endure. NATO bound Western Europe together. The Marshall Plan had rebuilt European economies. American power spanned the globe. In his final days in office, Truman reflected on the world he had helped shape. The United States had emerged as leader of the free world, not through conquest, but through choice and circumstance. The Cold War he had helped launch would continue for decades, but its basic architecture was now fixed. His last act was to write a letter to incoming President Eisenhower. "The president," he wrote, "must be ready to make decisions that determine the fate of civilization." He knew whereof he spoke. The former haberdasher had made such decisions repeatedly, reshaping the global order with each choice. On January 20th, 1953, Truman boarded a train back to Independence, Missouri. No longer would he receive the daily briefings about Soviet movements. No longer would his signature launch armies or reshape nations. He left behind a transformed America, a superpower by circumstance, a global leader by necessity. "I never wanted to be president," he told reporters at his final press conference. "But I guess the job and I found each other at the right time. History would agree." The plain-spoken man from Missouri had guided America through its emergence as a superpower with a steadiness that his more famous predecessor might have envied. The atomic age, the Cold War, the American century, all had been birthed on his watch. The decisions made in that old Oval Office would echo through decades to come. The hat salesman from Kansas City had become the architect of the post-war world, proving that greatness sometimes comes wrapped in the most ordinary packaging. As his train pulled away from Washington, Truman opened his briefcase and found it empty. Someone had already removed the classified documents he'd carried for nearly 8 years. The weight of the world had officially passed to other shoulders. Harry Truman was going home.